In the mist-shrouded hills of northern England, where ancient manor houses stand like silent sentinels against the relentless march of time, there existed in the year 1891 a collection so beautiful and so terrifying that those who encountered it were forever changed by the experience. Ravenshollow Manor, the ancestral home of the Albright family for more than 3 centuries, housed within its Gothic walls what was considered to be the finest assemblage of Victorian dolls in all of Europe. Porcelain faces of angelic perfection, dressed in silks and laces that spoke of wealth and refinement beyond the reach of ordinary collectors. But the dolls that filled the nursery wing of Ravenshollow Manor were far more than mere toys or decorative objects. They were the obsession, the life's work, and ultimately the doom of Eleanor Albright, a woman whose love for these exquisite creations would transform from innocent passion into a nightmare that would consume not only her sanity, but her very soul. What began as a collector's pride in beautiful objects would evolve into something far darker, a relationship between creator and creation that defied every law of nature and challenged every assumption about the boundaries between the living and the dead. Eleanor Albright had inherited both Ravenshollow Manor and her passion for dolls from her grandmother, Constance Albright, a woman whose own obsession with these porcelain companions had been legendary throughout the county. The collection that Eleanor inherited consisted of more than 200 dolls, each one meticulously crafted by the finest artisans of Europe, their faces painted with such skill that they seemed to possess the spark of life itself. But it was not merely their beauty that made these dolls extraordinary. It was the history that surrounded them, the stories of the children who had once owned them, and the mysterious circumstances under which they had come to reside at Ravenshollow. The mansion itself seemed designed to house such a collection, its nursery wing containing rooms upon rooms of display cases, each one climate-controlled and perfectly lit to showcase the dolls in their full glory. The walls were lined with portraits of the Albright women who had maintained the collection over the generations, their eyes following visitors with the same intense gaze that characterized the porcelain faces of their beloved dolls. It was a shrine to childhood innocence and feminine beauty, yet there was something unsettling about the perfection of it all, as if the very act of preserving these symbols of youth and joy had somehow trapped them in a state that was neither truly alive nor properly dead. Eleanor's own relationship with the collection had begun in early childhood, when her grandmother had first introduced her to what she called her children, the dolls who had been her constant companions through decades of solitude in the vast manor. Unlike other children who might have been frightened by the intense stare of so many porcelain eyes, Eleanor had felt immediately at home among the collection, finding in their silent presence a comfort and understanding that human companions had never provided. As she grew into adulthood and inherited full responsibility for the collection, Eleanor's devotion to her dolls deepened into something that concerned the few family members and friends who remained in contact with her. She spoke to the dolls as if they were living beings, caring for them with a tenderness that bordered on maternal obsession, and spending hours each day in their company, maintaining elaborate conversations that observers found deeply disturbing. The first signs that Eleanor's relationship with her collection had crossed into dangerous territory appeared in 1889, when she began writing detailed diary entries that documented not just her daily care of the dolls, but their supposed responses to her attention. According to these journals, the dolls had begun to display subtle signs of awareness, slight movements of their heads, changes in facial expression, and even whispered communications that only Eleanor could hear. "Sweet Evangeline spoke to me again today," Eleanor wrote in one early entry. "She told me that she was lonely for the little girl who had once loved her, a child named Mary, who had died of consumption in 1847. Evangeline remembers Mary's touch, her voice, her tears when the fever took hold. She asks me to help her understand why children must leave their dolls behind when they go to heaven." The diary entries became increasingly detailed and disturbing as Eleanor documented a world in which her dolls possessed not only consciousness, but memories, emotions, and desires that seemed to bridge the gap between their porcelain existence and the human lives they had once shared. She wrote of dolls who mourned their dead owners, who whispered secrets about the families who had possessed them, and who expressed fears about their future that seemed remarkably human in their complexity and depth. But it was in the winter of 1890 that Eleanor's diaries began to record phenomena that transcended simple imagination or psychological delusion and entered territory that challenged every rational explanation. She described discovering tears on the cheeks of her dolls, not water, but thick crimson drops that stained their porcelain faces and left traces on their clothing that could not be washed away. The first occurrence of what Eleanor termed the weeping involved a doll named Cordelia, whose aristocratic bearing and elaborate costume suggested she had once belonged to a family of considerable wealth and status. Eleanor found her one morning with dark red stains trailing from her glass eyes down her pale cheeks, the substance still wet and warm to the touch, despite the fact that the nursery had been locked and empty throughout the night. Cordelia's tears are not water, but something far more precious, Eleanor wrote in her diary entry for December 15, 1890. They are the crystallized sorrow of all the children who have loved and lost, the physical manifestation of griefs too deep for ordinary expression. When I touched the red drops with my finger, I felt such overwhelming sadness that I wept myself for hours, understanding for the first time the depth of loneliness that my dear ones have endured. The phenomenon spread rapidly through the collection, with Eleanor discovering more dolls each day that bore the mysterious crimson stains. But rather than being frightened by these occurrences, she seemed to view them as confirmation of what she had always believed, that her dolls were more than mere objects, that they possessed souls capable of feeling and expressing the deepest human emotions. Her response to the weeping dolls was not to seek help or explanation, but to increase her devotion to their care, spending even more time in the nursery wing and developing elaborate rituals designed to comfort what she believed to be their troubled spirits. She began conducting what she called tea parties, where she would arrange groups of dolls around miniature tables, serving them imaginary refreshments while engaging in conversations that grew more complex and detailed with each passing day. As we delve deeper into this disturbing tale of obsession and supernatural manifestation, we must confront the possibility that some collectors become so consumed by their passion that they lose the ability to distinguish between reality and fantasy. The story we're exploring forces us to question whether the objects we surround ourselves with might possess their own form of consciousness, and what prices we might pay for relationships that exist beyond the boundaries of human understanding. If you find yourself drawn to these investigations into the darker aspects of collecting and possession, please share your thoughts in the comments below and join our community by subscribing to the channel. The transformation in Eleanor's behavior following the onset of the weeping became apparent to the few servants who remained at Ravenshollow Manor, though their accounts of what they witnessed were often dismissed by outside observers as the exaggerated tales of superstitious domestics. Mrs. Hartwell, the housekeeper who had served the Albright family for more than 30 years, documented changes in her mistress that went far beyond simple eccentricity and suggested genuine psychological deterioration. According to Mrs. Hartwell's testimony, Eleanor began spending entire nights in the nursery wing, often found in the morning sitting among her dolls in elaborate tableaux that she claimed they had arranged themselves during the dark hours. The housekeeper reported discovering Eleanor engaged in animated conversations with empty air, responding to questions and comments that only she could hear, while the dolls around her seemed to have moved from their previous positions, despite the fact that no human hand had touched them. More disturbing were the reports of sounds emanating from the nursery wing during the night, not just Eleanor's voice, but what the servants described as a chorus of childlike whispers and giggles that seemed to come from the dolls themselves. Mrs. Hartwell noted that these sounds were often accompanied by the creaking of floorboards and the rustle of clothing, as if invisible children were moving through the rooms and playing games that only they could understand. The physical evidence of supernatural activity in the nursery wing accumulated rapidly as the winter progressed. In addition to the blood tears that continued to appear on more dolls each day, the servants began discovering that the positions of the collection had changed overnight, despite Eleanor's insistence that she had not moved them. Dolls that had been seated in chairs would be found standing in corners, while others that had been arranged in groups would be discovered in entirely different rooms, positioned as if they had walked there of their own accord. Most unsettling was the discovery that some dolls had begun to show signs of wear and aging that seemed to occur far more rapidly than should have been possible given their careful preservation. Faces that had been pristine porcelain began to develop fine cracks and discoloration, while clothing that had been meticulously maintained showed signs of use and handling by invisible hands. It was as if the dolls were aging in real time, experiencing the passage of years in days or weeks. Helena's diary entries during this period reveal a woman whose perception of reality had become so distorted by her obsession that she no longer distinguished between the physical world and the supernatural phenomena she believed herself to be witnessing. Her writings describe elaborate social hierarchies among the dolls, with certain figures serving as leaders, while others played supporting roles in dramas that unfolded according to rules and logic that existed only in Eleanor's increasingly fractured mind. "The court of Queen Victoria doll has become quite complex," she wrote in January 1891. "Lady Catherine has been accused of spreading gossip about Master Timothy, while little Sophie continues to pine for her lost brother, who was sold to another collector years ago. The tensions in the nursery require careful management, as disagreements among the children can lead to most unpleasant manifestations." The manifestations that Eleanor referenced became increasingly violent and destructive as her mental state deteriorated further. Mrs. Hartwell reported finding dollhouses demolished and miniature furniture scattered throughout the rooms, while Eleanor claimed that her children were acting out their frustrations through tantrums and rebellions that required constant intervention and discipline. The climax of Eleanor's descent into madness came in February 1891, when she announced to the remaining servants that she had discovered the true source of her doll's supernatural animation. According to her increasingly frantic diary entries, she had realized that each doll contained the trapped soul of a child who had died while in its possession, spirits that had become bound to the porcelain forms through the intensity of their final attachment to these beloved objects. This revelation led Eleanor to develop what she called the Great Work, a project designed to free the trapped souls by providing them with more suitable vessels for their continued existence. Her plan, detailed in diary entries that grew more disturbing with each page, involved the systematic destruction of her precious collection, combined with ritual procedures that she believed would allow the spirits to find peace or to transfer to new forms that could better accommodate their needs. The implementation of this plan began with Eleanor's attempts to communicate directly with the spirits she believed inhabited her dolls, conducting seances and ritual ceremonies in the nursery wing that the servants reported could be heard throughout the manor. The sounds that emerged from these sessions were described as inhuman, not just Eleanor's voice, but screams, wails, and utterances in languages that no one could identify. The first doll to be destroyed as part of the Great Work was Evangeline, the beautiful blonde figure who had been Eleanor's favorite since childhood. The destruction was conducted according to procedures that Eleanor had developed through what she claimed was direct communication with the spirit world, involving the systematic dismantling of the doll while prayers and incantations were recited to ensure the proper release of its trapped inhabitant. But rather than bringing peace to Eleanor or ending the supernatural manifestations, the destruction of Evangeline seemed to intensify the phenomena beyond anything that had been experienced previously. The remaining dolls began to exhibit signs of distress that were visible even to the skeptical servants, their positions changing more frequently, their clothes becoming disheveled, and their faces bearing expressions that seemed to shift from serenity to anguish, depending on the observer's perspective. The blood tears that had been the first sign of supernatural activity now appeared on dozens of dolls simultaneously, creating scenes of mass weeping that Eleanor interpreted as mourning for their destroyed companion. But the crimson fluid was no longer confined to their faces. It began to appear on their hands, their clothing, and eventually on the floors and walls of the nursery wing itself, as if the very building was bleeding in sympathy with its porcelain inhabitants. Eleanor's response to these escalating phenomena was to accelerate her program of destruction, convinced that only by freeing all the trapped spirits could she bring peace to Ravenshollow Manor. Her diary entries from this period describe a woman who had lost all connection to reality, writing about conversations with invisible spirits and receiving instructions for increasingly complex rituals that were supposed to guide the souls of dead children to their eternal rest. The servants' accounts of Eleanor's final weeks reveal a woman who had become as much a prisoner of her obsession as the spirits she believed herself to be liberating. She rarely left the nursery wing, surviving on scraps of food that Mrs. Hartwell left outside the doors and communicating with the outside world only through notes that expressed growing paranoia about forces that sought to prevent her from completing her sacred mission. The discovery of Eleanor's body came in March 1891, when Mrs. Hartwell broke down the doors to the nursery wing after not seeing her mistress for several days. What she found there would haunt her for the remainder of her life and create a mystery that investigators were never able to solve satisfactorily. Eleanor was found seated in the center of the main nursery room, surrounded by the broken fragments of her entire collection. Every doll had been systematically dismantled, according to procedures that seemed to follow ritualistic patterns, their porcelain heads carefully separated from their bodies and arranged in precise geometric formations around Eleanor's motionless form. The blood that had once appeared only as tears on the dolls' faces now covered every surface of the room, creating patterns that seemed deliberate rather than random. Most disturbing was the condition of Eleanor herself. Her body showed no signs of violence or injury, yet her face bore an expression of such profound terror that Mrs. Hartwell initially assumed she had died of fright. The official cause of death was listed as heart failure, though Dr. William Morrison, who conducted the examination, noted physiological evidence that suggested she had experienced extremes of fear and stress that exceeded anything he had encountered in his medical career. The investigation that followed Eleanor's death revealed evidence that challenged every rational explanation for what had occurred at Ravens Hollow Manor. The blood that covered the nursery wing was confirmed to be human, though its source could not be determined, and its volume far exceeded what could have come from Eleanor's body. Chemical analysis revealed properties that did not match normal human blood, containing elements and compounds that suggested exposure to conditions or substances that conventional science could not identify. The arrangement of the broken dolls suggested ritual significance that experts in folklore and anthropology could not decipher, though the precision and complexity of the patterns indicated systematic planning and execution that seemed inconsistent with the random destruction that might be expected from someone in the grip of madness. The fragments themselves showed signs of damage that could not be explained through normal breakage, with some pieces bearing marks that suggested they had been broken from within rather than by external force. Most puzzling was the discovery of additional diary entries written in Eleanor's handwriting, but containing information that she could not have known, and perspectives that seemed to come from sources other than her own consciousness. These final entries described experiences of multiple simultaneous awareness, as if Eleanor had become a conduit for the voices and memories of the children whose spirits she believed inhabited her collection. "I am no longer Eleanor alone," read one of these disturbing passages. "I am Mary, who loved Evangeline and died calling her name. I am James, who clutched his soldier doll as fever consumed him. I am Sarah, who gave her favorite baby to her sister before the angels took her home. We are all here together now, sharing thoughts and memories that span centuries of childhood love and loss." The federal investigation that was quietly conducted following Eleanor's death revealed connections between her case and similar incidents involving collectors whose obsessions had led to unexplained deaths and supernatural phenomena. Agent Patricia Vance, who specialized in cases involving unusual psychological and paranormal elements, documented patterns that suggested Eleanor's experience was part of a broader phenomenon affecting individuals whose collections achieved certain characteristics of age, emotional significance, and concentrated attention. The evidence suggests that objects which have been closely associated with intense human emotion, particularly the emotions of children, may retain some form of psychic imprint that can be activated under specific conditions, Agent Vance wrote in her classified report. The collector's obsessive attention appears to serve as a catalyst that awakens dormant forces within these objects, creating feedback loops that can ultimately overwhelm the human psyche and produce manifestations that transcend normal categories of psychological or paranormal phenomena. As our investigation reveals the horrifying conclusion of Eleanor's obsession with her supernatural collection, we must ask ourselves what dangers might lurk within the objects we surround ourselves with, and whether some attachments to the past might open doorways to forces that should remain forever closed. If these revelations about the dark side of collecting compel you to reflect on the prices we pay for preserving memories and the risks of forming bonds with objects that may carry their own hidden histories, please consider leaving a like and subscribing for more explorations into the supernatural dangers that hide in plain sight. The aftermath of Eleanor's death saw the immediate closure of Ravenshollow Manor and the dispersal of what remained of her collection to museums and private collectors throughout Europe. But the influence of the possessed dolls did not end with their separation, as reports began to emerge from the new owners of phenomena that echoed what had occurred at the manor: blood tears, mysterious movements, and psychological effects that seemed to intensify with prolonged exposure. The Victoria and Albert Museum, which acquired several pieces from the collection, was forced to remove them from display after guards reported unexplained incidents and visitors complained of feeling watched and followed by the dolls' intensely lifelike gazes. Similar problems were reported by private collectors who found that their new acquisitions seemed to affect other dolls in their collections, creating cascading supernatural effects that transformed entire collections into sources of fear and disturbance. Dr. Margaret Sinclair, a psychiatrist who studied the psychological effects of the Albright collection on its subsequent owners, documented patterns of obsessive behavior and reality distortion that seemed to replicate Eleanor's own descent into madness. The dolls appear to exert a form of psychological influence that becomes stronger with prolonged exposure, she wrote. Owners report feeling compelled to care for them as if they were living beings, while experiencing dreams and visions that seem to come from external sources rather than their own unconscious minds. The academic study of the case was complicated by the reluctance of current owners to allow scientific examination of their dolls, partly due to fear of negative publicity and partly because of genuine concern about what such investigation might reveal or trigger. The few pieces that were made available for study showed ongoing evidence of the blood tears phenomenon, though laboratory analysis consistently failed to determine the source or composition of the mysterious red fluid. Paranormal investigators who managed to gain access to some of the dolls reported electronic equipment malfunctions, unexplained temperature fluctuations, and electromagnetic anomalies that suggested the presence of energies that conventional instruments could not properly measure or identify. Photography of the dolls often revealed anomalies, faces that appeared different from various angles, eyes that seemed to track movement, and backgrounds that showed unexplained shadows and lights. The modern legacy of Eleanor's collection continues to influence the antique doll market, where pieces identified as having been part of the Albright assemblage command premium prices despite their troubling reputation. Some collectors actively seek out these dolls precisely because of their supernatural associations, believing that the phenomena associated with them represent genuine contact with the spirit world rather than dangerous manifestations that should be avoided. The few remaining diary entries that Eleanor wrote during her final days have been preserved in the British Museum's restricted collection, where they continue to provide insights into the psychology of extreme collecting and the potential for beloved objects to become vehicles for forces that transcend normal understanding. Her final entry, written just days before her death, offers a chilling glimpse into a mind that had completely surrendered to influences beyond human comprehension. "The children are calling me home," Eleanor wrote in her distinctive handwriting. "They have shown me that death is not an ending, but a transformation, and that love strong enough can bridge any gap between the living and the dead. I go to join them willingly, knowing that our reunion will be eternal and that together we will find the peace that has eluded us in this world of broken hearts and abandoned toys." The building that housed Ravenshollow Manor was eventually demolished in 1923 after decades of standing empty due to reports of supernatural activity that made it impossible to sell or inhabit. Local residents had complained of lights in the windows, sounds of children playing, and the persistent smell of roses that had been Eleanor's favorite perfume. The destruction of the building seemed to diminish, but not eliminate these phenomena, as the site continued to be associated with unexplained incidents well into the modern era. The broader implications of the Albright case for understanding the relationship between human consciousness and inanimate objects continue to influence research into anomalous psychology and paranormal phenomena. The idea that intense emotional attachment could imbue objects with some form of consciousness or supernatural energy challenges materialist assumptions about the nature of reality while providing possible explanations for phenomena that conventional science struggles to address. The case also raises profound questions about the ethics of collecting objects that may carry psychological or spiritual significance for their original owners, particularly items associated with children who died young and whose attachment to their possessions might have been intense enough to survive physical death. The possibility that collectors might unknowingly be acquiring objects that contain trapped or restless spirits creates moral dilemmas that the antique trade has been reluctant to acknowledge or address. The psychological profile of Eleanor Albright has become a reference point for understanding the development of collecting obsessions and the warning signs that indicate when healthy interest has crossed into dangerous territory. Her transformation from normal collector to possessed victim illustrates how gradually and subtly the boundary between appreciation and obsession can be crossed, and how objects of beauty can become instruments of psychological and spiritual destruction. The dolls that once graced the nursery wing of Raven's Hollow Manor remain scattered throughout the world, their current owners often unaware of their history or the phenomena that may still be associated with them. Some have disappeared from public view entirely, their owners choosing secrecy over the risks that might come with acknowledging their possession of objects linked to supernatural tragedy. The horrible history of the dolls that cried blood serves as a warning about the dangers that can lurk within objects of beauty and sentiment, and the prices that collectors may pay when their passion transcends healthy boundaries and enters territory where the living and the dead intersect in ways that human understanding was never meant to comprehend. Eleanor Albright's fate reminds us that some collections exact prices far greater than money, and that the objects we love most deeply may be the ones most capable of destroying us. In the end, perhaps the most disturbing aspect of Eleanor's story is not the supernatural phenomena that destroyed her, but the recognition that her love for her dolls was genuine and pure, transformed into something monstrous, not by evil intent, but by forces that exist beyond the boundaries of human control. Her devotion to her collection was a form of love, but love without limits can become indistinguishable from madness, and the desire to preserve and protect can evolve into compulsions that ultimately destroy everything they seek to cherish. The tears of blood that marked the beginning of Eleanor's descent into horror may have been the manifestation of genuine sorrow, the crystallized grief of children whose love for their dolls had been strong enough to survive death itself, seeking expression through the only vessels available to them in a world that no longer acknowledged their existence. Whether these were the tears of the dead or the living, of spirits or of madness, may be less important than the recognition that some forms of love are too powerful for the mortal world to contain, and that the objects we use to preserve our most precious memories may sometimes preserve far more than we ever intended or could bear to understand.